Hello, welcome to the first episode of my new podcast, Fantasy and Faith. My name is Noor Jahangir. I am a fantasy author. So, this first podcast isn't really scripted. I'm just going to go with a bunch of questions I've generated in ChatGPT to help prompt me along. So, to start off with, I want to introduce myself about when I first started writing. Um, I'm not really sure when I started writing originally. My earliest memory of writing something worthwhile was when I wrote a review of Paddle to the Sea, which is a classic novel that was presented as a BBC children's show. And I wrote a review of that when I was, I think, 8 years old, and it was picked up by my teacher. And it was so good that she took it to the head teacher, and eventually ended up being hung up in the school hall for everyone else to have a look at as well. What drew me to writing in the beginning was the ability to inspire. Um, I was 7 years old. My class teacher, Mrs. Bracewell, read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to me, well, to our whole class. And it captured my imagination so fiercely that I became obsessed with reading and with this idea that just from a number of words, like C.S. Lewis talks about this image he has of a lamppost in the middle of the woods surrounded by snow. And that was what triggered the whole scene, and then from that scene, the book. So that's what drew me, the ability to inspire from just simple images and simple concepts into larger concepts. The first thing that I wrote that I was proud of, again, it's probably this review that I wrote of Paddle to the Sea. Um, but then the next thing I remember was writing a werewolf story when I was 10 years old in my final year in primary school. And I found that to be something that I was proud of because it captured some themes that I was exploring in my mind. And I knew my school teacher at that time, Mr. Hodgkinson, was very keen on horror. And I wanted to try write something that impressed him. So I was proud of that piece of writing. My writing has evolved over time in different ways. So when I wrote my first book, I was 14 years old. It was the first draft of what later became The Changeling King. And it was something that I would say came on me like a fever. I had to get it all out on paper. I used up a whole bunch of exercise books that I was supposed to be using for class, but I wrote furiously with big pens and standard exercise books until I had this first draft written. But then it took me another, I'd say, 16 years to get the book to the point where I was happy enough to put it out into the world. And so I evolved as a writer through writing other things. I spent some time working on a magazine called Subul Salam, which wrote about mysticism and Sufism in Islam. I was a staff writer there for a couple of years. I did a course, part of the writing school, which was a correspondence course. It's not something that you do these days, but in the 90s, it was the done thing. And that helped develop me as a writer. And then I went to university, and one of the main reasons I went to university was to become a writer. And I saw that as a big part of my journey. I studied English with media studies and creative writing. And this was at what's known now as Bucks New University, but back then it was the Buckinghamshire Chilterns University College. I wrote a lot of things during that time. Some of it I would say I enjoyed writing. Some of it I wrote because it was part of the exercise, or I was writing to impress my classmates. Um, but none of it really had that much substance other than one or two short stories, which I later developed and then had published on online magazines. But really, it's life that adds the salt and pepper and all the spices to the story. Um, Personal experiences, personal losses, hardships that you go through. That's what adds the mileage and adds the experiences that you can talk about. more authoritatively than you would if you hadn't had any of those experiences. So I think that was an important stage of my development as a writer. Then, after I'd written The Changeling King, the final draft, I think I must have gone in 6 or 7 drafts before I had it published. Um, I was looking at responses. I was blogging along at that time as well. I'd started blogging, I'd say about 2003, 2004, using different platforms until I arrived on WordPress as my main web page and blog. And recently, in the last 2, 3 months, I started on Substack as well. So I've been blogging there too. Um, so after that, I looked at whether my stories were doing well, and I felt it wasn't the big success that I'd always dreamed it. So I tried changing tack. I tried writing what was more marketable. So I wrote instead a middle grade novel. It was more an adventure story with elements of fantasy in there, called The Adventures of Some Kid. And that, um, much shorter work, slightly different stylistically, is more kind of humor in it as well. Um, but it was based on market research. It was based on conversations I had with librarians, with you know, people who um, are into reading. It's just casual discussions with them. So, what kind of thing would you like to read? And that led me to write The Adventures of Some Kid. So I enjoyed writing that story as well. Maybe not as it wasn't as kind of challenging and deep as The Changing King was for me, but I still enjoyed the character. I based him a little bit off my kid brother, but I made him slightly more idiotic just to play for the laughs and give him more of a character arc than if he was just brilliant to start off with. And that was a humbling lesson as well because, again, it didn't have the success that The Changing King had. Maybe my marketing wasn't as good that time. I think marketing is a bit of a dark art anyway. It's not really clear what works, what doesn't work. Um, so that was a learning lesson for me. But then I kind of dropped off for a while from the writing scene. I started focusing on my studies. I did a career change in my day job. I went into education, spent a couple of years completing a postgraduate um, certificate in education so I could teach as a professional. And straight after I finished that, I started doing my doctorate. And the doctorate I thought was going to last 3 years and then I'd be done. But it ended up taking me 6 years. Now, even that's added to my writing style. It's made me more critical in thinking, more analytic, more evaluative, and I'd say more academic in the research that I do and the notes that I make um, in preparation for my writing. So I used to be what's called a pantser, somebody who writes straight away without really planning things out, to becoming somebody who plans in some detail beforehand before I go on to um, put pen to paper and start writing. So generally, I tend to start with an outline and then I work my way to um, put together the story itself. So currently, I'm working on Aladdin, which is a retelling of the classic Arabian Nights story. I call it the Arabian Nights story because it wasn't originally part of the Thousand and One Nights. It's something that came about a little later on, but was incorporated into the European collection of those stories. Um, so that's what I'm currently working on. I originally wrote a version of that when I was 16, 17, I think. Um, Printed about 100 copies of it, and then those copies disappeared into the ether. Most of them were sold. Some of them people took away to sell in different parts of England. So I didn't really see or hear much back about how successful that was. Um, so the original plan was to kind of add a few more plot points, add a bit more character depth, and then re-release it. But looking at it when I started writing, I felt like it wasn't good enough. It wasn't honest enough for me to just pick up pen and paper and try to fill in some of the gaps and then put out something that I wouldn't be proud of bring back out there. So instead, I've started rewriting it from scratch. I've added more depth. I've leaned more into the classic Aladdin and the Magic Lamp story and less um, on the Disney version of Aladdin, which I'll be honest, I think the original was heavily influenced by the Disney version of Aladdin, but this retelling is more in keeping with the original story, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, but with some other elements that I've added in and some characters that are in the Disney movie or in this. I've changed the princess's name from Jasmine to Princess Badrul Budur, which is what she was called in the original story, which means uh, the brightest of bright moons. Um, so that's what I'm currently working on. There's going to be um, a couple of sequels to it, not like direct sequels, but similar kind of thing. So I'm going to rewrite the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, which I'm just going to title Ali Baba. And Sinbad's Seven Voyages, I'm going to write as well as the third in this series. I'm thinking of calling the series the Arabian Dream series. I'm working with an artist who is a close family member as well. She's designed the three covers, and hopefully, I will be sharing those covers on Substack and on my blog as well in due course. So, one of the questions that ChatGPT has come up for me are what genres or types of writing do you gravitate towards, and how did that develop? So, I've always leaned towards fantasy and science fiction and some horror. Fantasy's always appealed to me from a young age, and science fiction, mostly because of Star Wars and the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and then children's movies that came out in the 80s, like Labyrinth, um, Flight of the Navigator. Those kind of things also inspired me as well. And then C.S. Lewis's line, The Witch in the Wardrobe. When that was read to me, I wanted to read it for myself. Then I read all the other following books, and then I kind of started looking for things that was similar. So fantasy has always been something that I've been drawn to. Um, and here's another interesting question: do you keep all writing, and what does it feel like to revisit? I've got the original version of The Changeling King. I've still got the exercise books stored away. I don't like reading stuff that I've written in the past. I mean, I can't even read the published version because I start seeing mistakes. I start seeing things that need fixing, and that's already in the public domain. So I don't want to be that guy who's constantly editing and uploading new versions of the same book over and over again. So I want to be able to move forward and move away from that. So I don't tend to read my old stuff, but I do keep a copy of it, and I keep some early drafts there as well. It acts as a bit like evidence, a bit of audit keeping, and part of my history, I suppose. So I can keep hold of it. What does writing mean to me now? So writing is not an easy thing. I mean, sometimes it comes easily to me, but it's also a difficult thing as well because once you finished it, it's out of your hands. The hard part of writing isn't the writing itself; it's more the kind of polishing it up, redrafting it, and then getting it in front of an audience, getting other people to like it, and being able to listen to the criticism. Those are the hard things for me. Uh, but there are things that we have to do. As I've noted already, I have a day job, so writing is normally fitted around the day job. It's also fitted around my studies. I'm still finishing off a few amendments on my dissertation before I hand it in, and then hopefully I can graduate and not have to think about it too much. I am doing some academic writing as well. I've been invited to write a methodology piece for Sage Methods Online. This would be my second one. So I am writing on the academic front as well. But most of my writing I tend to do either in the evenings or on the weekends or during my holidays. What have I learned about myself through writing? That's another tough question. Um, I tend to pour a lot of myself into my writing, and that's probably one of the reasons why I'm sensitive to how people talk about my characters and my stories, because there's a little piece of me in every one of those, even the villains. In the Changeling King, I've got this um, troll that's running around on Earth called Vash. I see a lot of myself in Vash. Um, the Changeling King, the titular character, um, I, a little bit of his story resonates with me because of things that happened in my past um, that made me feel slightly abandoned, and that's something that I connect with in my villain character for that book. So there's something of me there as well. Um, I've learned that I'm not too precious about what happens in the story so much as what direction the characters want to go in. So I might have outlined something, but I don't stick to it religiously. If a character is pulling in a different direction, I allow myself to explore that direction, and quite often it turns out to be better than what I originally plotted out. So I didn't know that about myself previously until I started writing. That despite detailed planning, I'm willing to go off track. In my professional life, I don't do that. If I make a plan, I tend to stick to it. Um, but in my writing, I seem to be a little bit more free to do that kind of thing. So I've already talked a bit about what I'm currently working towards. There's also another book that I've got in my written down, and I'm building up the world for that story. So I'm not going to talk about it today. Um, but I'm hoping over the next 10 to 12 years to make writing my main job. I want to, as much as I enjoy teaching and helping people, I want to be able to put that aside and just focus on writing. And I think that's where I would like to be by the time um, 20, say 2035. I want to be a full-time writer, and I want to be making enough for my writing that I can support myself and my family. So what advice would I give myself to my younger self as a writer? Um, and that would be, I think, the last point that I discuss. I think I would tell myself to be patient, to not to rush, not to try to get my books out there as quickly as possible. Um, take the advice I was given. I had I was lucky enough to get advice from Jenny Wirtz, who's a amazing fantasy author. She co-authored the Empire series with Raymond Feast, who happens to be one of my top two, three authors. My top two, three, I'd say, are um, David Gemmell, Raymond Feast, and I'm not too sure who my third top writer would be. Um, there's quite a few up there that I respect. James Barkley is one of those that's in my top 10. He's also a friend, part of the British Fantasy Society. So yeah, it's a tough one to pick. But I would say take the advice. The advice that Johnny Words gave to me was that you're not ready, give it time. Another piece of advice I learned a lot more recently was from a Brandon Sanderson lecture, where he said that write your first 5, 6 books and then put them away, because that was just you learning how to write, and then go with the seventh book, take that to the agents and the publishers. So had I known that, maybe I wouldn't have taken such a long break away from writing as I have done. Um, Maybe I would have carried on, and maybe I would possibly be writing full time now. But we make mistakes, we learn from them, and we move forward. So that's my first podcast, podcast number one for fantasy and faith, or faith and fantasy, whichever you like the sound of. Give me some feedback on what kind of things you would like me to cover in my next podcast, and we will take it from there. So if you've been listening, thank you very much. Do subscribe to my Substack, and hopefully there'll be another podcast next week. Thank you and goodbye.